Welcome back to the weekly news roundup. It is a very light news week this week, so we are testing something slightly different. We're just going to do a single topic and do a little bit more of a deep dive on it, maybe more like a standard week-long video, just, hey, during the weekly news roundup. And it's relevant to modern news things. So this deals, of course, with the Russians and the geopolitics and the Linux, and it asks this fundamental question near the end: should Linux leave the US of A? So, of course, we covered this last week in the news, where all of a sudden, out of the blue, 10 Russian developers who were maintainers of various components of the Linux kernel were removed from their maintainers list. And then there was a little bit of confusion about it. And then later on in the week, we got some clarification what happened. Now, number one, most people, I think, are more upset about how this happened than they were that it happened. So let that be a lesson to you in business. It's not always about doing the right or the wrong thing. More often than not, it is about doing the right or the wrong thing in the right or the wrong way. Now, we have to forgive them a little bit because, remember, this is the Linux Foundation and Linus Torvalds. And the Linux Foundation and Linus Torvalds are a bunch of Asperger's computer geeks. People skills are never high on their list of priorities. We can completely understand what happened and why. They don't respond to things in appropriate ways until they're absolutely forced to. We have to recognize this fact. All right. So all of that being said, however, it did raise some eyebrows, and effectively what happened, it wasn't that people were booted off the system because they were Russian. It happened that they were booted off the system because the people in their specific roles as maintainers were connected with Russian companies that had sanctions on them. And it's not just United States sanctions, it is sanctions from various companies for various things that are going on in the world, wars, and mostly the Ukraine war. But also we have other factors to consider, oppressions and things like that. So there is some tension between Russia and some other people in the world. And so the question happened to be not why did we remove them, but that we had to remove them. So once the solid explanation came out, then it kind of comes out and it's like, okay, we understand what happened. Although even Linus's message wasn't as good as it should have been. He, instead of focusing on the specific issue, instead calls out the trolls and the spammers that were kind of annoying him over it, because in all honesty, if you start annoying people, then yeah, they tend to not be as kind to you. And especially if people skills is not higher on your list of priorities, then we know that's probably a little bit of a case. So Torvalds writes, and I don't actually remember if we read word for word what his release was last week, so let's do that now. Okay, lots of Russian trolls out and about. It's entirely clear why the change was done. It's not getting reverted, and multiple random anonymous accounts to try to grassroot it by Russian troll factories isn't going to change anything. And FYI, for the actual innocent bystanders who aren't troll farm accounts, the various compliance requirements are not just a US thing. If you haven't heard of Russian sanctions yet, you should try reading the news someday. And by news, I don't mean Russian state-sponsored spam. As to sending me a revert patch, please use whatever mush you call brains. I'm Finnish. Did you think I'd be supporting Russian aggression? Apparently, it's not just a lack of real news, it's lack of history knowledge, too. That was his response, and it wasn't necessarily a good, clean-cut response. It definitely focused a whole lot more. Clearly, people were creating a bunch of accounts and spamming him to make it look like grassroots type thing. I completely understand the frustration with that. I have one of my clients, they are, for whatever reason, deciding to use the comment feature requiring an account login. So there's an account login, account creation page. In the span of 1 week, I cleared out 42,000 spam users last weekend. We just had 7,000 more come in. I'm working on ways to mitigate this. I think we have found a way to mitigate 90% of it, which means I'll be cleaning out 100 a week. instead of, 7,000 a week. So that's good. But yeah, people get annoyed and then they just start doing crazy stuff like this and trying to avert the thing. Now, he does say at the core of this, it didn't have anything to do with the fact that you're Russian. It had to do with compliance requirements. Now, one long-term maintainer, Harold Welt, this is from Germany, he actually wrote a paper here on his blog post. This is actually the reader review because this guy does not know how to publish a blog post. Look at this thing. That's an abomination. Switch on reader mode there. We can actually read it. So, Harold Welt, if you're watching, please fix the theme on your site. Anyway, I sincerely regret to see Linux kernel patches like this one removing Russian developers from the maintainers file. To me, it's a sign or maybe a symptom of how far the Linux kernel developer community, I remember it from 20 years ago, has changed, how much it has alienated itself from what I remember back in the day. Now, he does mention some of the true points. The first is it was intransparent. That is true. They got rid of a bunch of people and then only addressed it after people are, wait, why am I not in the maintainers file anymore? Why have my status has been revoked? Why is my name not here anymore? So this was not done transparently. On this point, he is correct. And number two, it says it discriminates developers based on their presumed Russian nationality based on their names, email addresses, domain names, or employer. Okay, the only point of that statement that is true is the employer part. And the reason is any organization inside of a country with sanctions may not work with a company that a sanction is against. This had nothing to do with people that were presumed of Russian nationality. There are other Russians that are still on the Linux kernel team. Okay, it did not have anything to do with their email address domain directly, I should say, in that if their email address domain just happened to be RU, that's not enough to get them booted off the maintainers file. What it had to do with necessarily was their employer, and this is where the domain name could be valid if their domain name is from the official country that is on the sanctioned list. Because if the Linux Foundation allows Russian people associated with those employers to add kernel, patches to the kernel, the entire kernel could be sued by the United States government or whatever government wanted to take offense from violating the sanctions. This had to be done to protect the maintainers. It didn't have anything to do with the fact that somebody is Russian per se. It had to do with the specific employers. If a person on the maintainers list was connected to one of the companies, they had to be removed. That is my understanding of it. He does go in a little bit further with this. He talks about being a German and understanding that, he recognizes what it's like to be part of a regime that was not necessarily did well over the years. He mentions that, and that that necessarily does not necessarily reflect to him as a person, which is certainly true. But all of this, he misses the point that this isn't about, Russians bad. This had to do with specific sanctions. And the reason is, after a lot, now you understand, these sanctions have been around for a while. It took the Linux Foundation a long time discussing things with lawyers, figuring out exactly what they do. And so after a day passed with the comment by Linus Torvalds, James Bottomley, another Linux maintainer, clarified, we finally got clearance to publish the actual advice. So there are times you have to act without being openly transparent. I'm trying not to be political, but there was a certain circumstance that happened in a suburb of Denver, Colorado. And one side of the political aisle was saying it's a conspiracy. The other side is going, no, this is really happening. And meanwhile, people are like, well, what's the truth going on? And we didn't hear anything from the owner of the organization that controlled the entity at the center of the dispute until just a few weeks ago. They finally came out, clarified everything, and brought every bit of receipt. They did not comment on it one way or the other, agreeing with one side or the other, because they were doing everything they could do to work within the confines of the law. And when you're working within the confines of the law, the fastest way to screw up your case is to start blabbing your gums. You got to be quiet. So they finally got the advice. If your company is on US OFN SDN list, subject to OFAC sanctions program, or owned or controlled by a company on the list, our ability to collaborate with you will be subject to restrictions, and you cannot be in the maintainer's file. Now, there are other ways these maintainers can get back on the file by working independently from non-company assets. That is still a possibility. So it's not like they're forever booted off, and it's not like they booted off everybody with a Russian email address or whose name sounded like they were Russian in principle. That's not what happened, but they had to follow the law. And so this boils down to the U.S. sanctions. So the U.S. sanctions came out talking about how you had to handle it. So, of course, some people come out and say, well, isn't China just as big of a threat to the United States as Russia? Why don't we have sanctions against Chinese? Well, there's just no specific sanctions against a specific list of companies in China that are specifically working on the Linux kernel. So that's why. Now, ultimately, at the center of this, most people agree Linus Torvalds' response was not a good response. It was not entirely okay, as they say in this article here, which is certainly true. Okay, Linus Torvalds is not known for his people skills. Maybe he shouldn't be making any press releases about what's going on. Okay, maybe he should take like this approach where anything he wants to say must be filtered through somebody first if he's speaking on behalf of the foundation itself in this respect. Because he does not, it says to start with, he mentions compliance requirements are not just a U.S. thing. There are some countries that have sanctions. There are some countries that do not. Some of them have a lot more sanctions. Some of them have a lot less. And so ultimately, it boils down to the question behind this video. The community has several questions in mind, and some of them are pointed at Linus Torvalds and some at the Linux kernel project in general. Can someone's political stand make them ineligible to be a Linux maintainer? This is a fundamental question as we are starting to look at what is going on in the world as we are becoming far more divided in the stances that we happen to take. There are groups of people that are a little bit more open to be working with the other side of the aisle. However, there are people that will absolutely, under no way, shape, or form, work with somebody on the other side of the aisle, no matter what the cause or circumstance is. And that in and of itself is the biggest problem that we have. And it's going to be to the point where if certain factions take over key roles inside the Linux kernel, yes, it could very possibly get to the point where a political stand could make you ineligible to be a Linux maintainer. And that is a tragic thing. Now, it doesn't matter what country you're in. It doesn't matter. Are we talking about historical knowledge of all countries from the globe to form a compliance requirement? Do we have to have some way of getting together and figuring out what compliance should be for the whole globe? If the Linux kernel project is not a U.S. thing, then why is it about U.S. sanction lists? Well, the reason for that is because it is in the United States, governed by the United States law, and takes advantage of United States benefits for being a nonprofit in this organization. And so that's why it is subject to the laws. And number 4, does this set a precedent that is one of the most impactful open source project could not avoid getting into a complex geopolitical bias? This is the fundamental problem. Can we not set aside a little bit for the basics? Now, is there a difference between a sanctioned company, for example, working on a music player versus the core level operating system controlling all things? There's an argument that can be made for that, even though the music player itself could create a backdoor allowing a lot of things in. However, it is a bigger risk having a potential threat working on the core level of the system, not just the a music player, for example. It'd be easier to spot a weird hole in a music player than it would be in a whole operating system. And so these are all good questions to have. So should the Linux kernel leave the United States? Well, unfortunately, we don't have a world that is completely free of geopolitics. And so I'm not sure it makes a huge difference where it is at, but wherever it chooses to be at, it must comply with whatever the local laws are. Otherwise, we risk losing the Linux kernel altogether. And that would be tragic, because then we might actually all have to go back to like Windows or crap like that. I know BSD is a thing. It just sounded better. Come on. And so that is what is behind our question on this. Let me know what you think down below. In the meantime, if you want to help support the channel, we do have a locals page, switchedtolinux.locals.com. We have our short story over there for the month. Wonderful story about what is the story about? I'm like forgetting. It's been, my brain got that fried by all the things, or it's just like, okay, I got the story. And this was a fascinating story looking at some of the actual real life studies that are going on. I believe they were at Stanford University, where they were looking at how might one implant a memory into somebody. What the positive implication of this is, other than like a Total Recall-esque, I'm going to give you a memory of a vacation you've never had. Okay. But there are a lot of negative consequences, of which I explore in this brand new short story. You can get that over on Locals and on all of our other supporter networks. There's an audiobook available for download over there until the end of November, available until November 30th. With that, thank you for watching support over there on switchedtolinux.locals.com, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.